All right, so I know I said prototyping was next, but I forgot about something that we probably need to cover. So, just kidding. We're going to talk about measures. So, here's our favorite chart here that we're showing. And one of the things I wanted to cover today is what measures are present in some of these methods and how we can assess their validity or value. So, what are measures? And this will be super vague and sounds kind of weird and made up, but it is some way that we assess something. That is all a measure fundamentally is. We use them constantly day by day. So, an example, if you are going to walk out your front door and first you survey the street to see if there is a tiger around, that is a measure. You are measuring your environment for number of tigers. And then if it's zero, or you go out the door. Or maybe if it's less than two, you go out the door. I mean, measures can kind of be anything that we use. But how do we know when we found a good one? And this is kind of a critical aspect of a lot of psychology generally, because we are dealing with a black box and a person. So, how do we know that whatever we're doing to try to access what's in the box is consistent and accurate for what we need, what we're trying to do to help folks or whatever? So, it's kind of one of those things that we use measures all the time. They're a regular part of our life. But in psychological studies, we tend to formalize them a little bit, so we can all be talking about the same thing. So validity, you've probably gotten this lecture before, so I won't stress it too much, but in psychology, validity is the extent that a test or measure actually measures what it should measure. And there's more formal kind of definitions if you'd like, but there's also, depending on, there's no like defined set of validities. There can be all sorts of different ones, depending on where you look. But these are kind of the big ones that most of the time we need to just be aware of. So, internal validity, does the independent variable cause the change, or is there something else? External validity, can it be generalized? So, can it be applied to other folks, other groups of people or populations? Face validity, this is literally just, it looks good. It looks, the measure from what we can tell just looking at it, yeah, seems like it should work. Construct validity, so are we constructing our unit of measure well? Can be unit of measure, can be variable of interest, etc. But it's essentially whatever our abstract thing is, are we constructing our measure well about that? So, for example, if our measure is happiness that we're trying to measure, or if the criterion or topic or whatever that we're trying to measure is happiness, okay, is number of laughs a day a good measure of happiness? Within happiness, is there aspects of laughing that are fundamental and foundational in that way? Criterion validity, is the test correlated with a known outcome? So this is where, okay, we have this test and it assesses depression, and we can link it with, let's say, therapeutic outcomes, and see that the test reliably shows an increase in happiness, a decrease in depression. That's kind of how you'll get the criterion side of things. That also sometimes can get lumped in with statistical validity. And before any psychometrics folks jump on me, I know they're probably different in some very specific ways, but for this purpose, as long as you kind of know these foundational ones, you're good. but feel free if you're interested to look up other ones because they might be valuable for you. So the problem we run into in UX or HCI is that we have some issues. So the way a measure kind of progresses through its life is somebody proposes it. Hey, I have this new test for this thing, depression or anxiety, let's say. Everybody else should go try to use it, and let's compare and see if it works. That's typically how kind of psychological research and validation occurs. So we have to ask ourselves in UX or HCI is how many of our measures are solid and validated? Because keep in mind, most UX work exists within the corporate and commercial spheres. So a lot of it is proprietary. Sometimes we get anonymized case studies, but there's no actual evaluation or replication of these measures. When we come up with one, a lot of times we don't. A lot of times it's born in some place where it can't be shared freely for people to poke around at and try to replicate. And many UX measures are complete unknowns in terms of validity. It's not even a topic a lot of them engage with. But some others can be more reliable, and we can leverage some psychological research aspects to kind of get there. But it's important to remember that a lot of the folks that are working in some of these spaces, whether they're developer turned UX person, so they have some UX training or education, but primarily they were computer science grads or anything, a lot of them haven't had to deal with some of these fundamental concepts in psychology that those of us that came from this more psychological background, this is old hat to us. So it's important to kind of understand that the discipline that we're in or that we're studying, I suppose, here is shaped differently than some others. So user methods, I've got some charts here that I affectionately borrowed from Nielsen Norman Group. Basically, as we look at user methods, there's a couple different exemplars, I guess we'd say, or axioms about them. First, there are attitudinal ones and behavioral. So attitudinal methods are typically the ones where we're asking somebody to tell us. So this is attitudinal, we're getting their attitude and perception of this thing. Behavioral is when we observe them doing it and see if those line up, for example. And then qualitative and quantitative, we've gotten into this a little bit, but we'll explore it a little bit more, especially in the measures topic. It gets a little bit messy. So here's one of the first charts that I love. This one's super helpful for if you're kind of engaging in a project and you want to cover your bases, but you're not sure. Maybe you're doing something in a domain where there isn't an established gold standard of testing that thing. Then you can come in here and you can pick methods that cover behavioral to attitudinal, qualitative to quantitative. So, and then also you want to sometimes separate out the context of use. So, natural use of the product, scripted use, decontextualize. So, decontextualize is when they don't have the product in their hand. Or limited. So, it's use of a limited form of the project to study a specific aspect of the user experience. So, maybe you're exploring just an information architecture thing, so you're going to separate out that and do a cart sort or something like that. So so this can be helpful as you're planning and kind of trying to see where everything will lie for you. Another thing that I really want you to kind of notice is how this is separated. Qualitative is direct and quantitative is indirect. That might seem kind of counterintuitive to some of you, where we think of quantitative measures as direct measures. We're measuring some real numerical aspect of a thing. Can't get more direct, right? What's important to remember is in the user experience and HCI space, much like every other space of psychology, we're dealing with a black box. So the most direct we can get in terms of information collection is in the qualitative space. Looking at this one, so as you're asking questions about it, if we chart this or put this over top of the these axes, this is where you'll want to, your research methods will live in some of these spaces within these questions. Not exclusively, but it is something to kind of be aware of. If we go back here, so this is up here's what people do. Eye tracking, yeah, that's a pretty direct measure of what eyes do. If we're looking at why and how to fix it, usability testing, this is very much what's going on here. What about, whoops, how many and how much? Well, if we go back, we're looking at clickstream, A/B testing, unmoderated testing, even surveys are kind of in some of those spaces. So again, depends on where you're going, but you probably want a diversity of methods to make sure that you're capturing kind of all aspects of this so that you can build a product that is thoroughly researched and evaluated. So coming back to this, our favorite chart graph image thing here, as we go through this, I want you to really think about, and as you're kind of progressing through any projects, is just what are you actually measuring as a part of this, and where does it land in some of those aspects. So like going back to my favorite, I think aloud, purely qualitative, largely, I guess, not purely. If you have eye tracking, you can get some quantitative data out of that. Maybe you're counting every time that they click a certain button or they say a specific word. But fundamentally, it's qualitative in that you're getting qualitative feedback from your user. You're also going to be noting your qualitative thoughts about what they're doing, which is a qualitative behavioral aspect, because we will note a lot of times what they're saying, but then we also will note what they're actually doing as they're speaking. This is super helpful, as you'll find out when you do think alouds. Each person kind of has their own way of describing that they're stuck or that they're not sure what to do, and each one will be a little bit different, but after a couple minutes with a participant, you'll know what their stuck phrase is, and so you'll note that there's little nuances for each person, but the basic premise kind of holds, which speaks to kind of its validity in that way. But as you're going through, you really want to make sure that you're covering your bases when it comes to those measures. So here's some other common measures you might run into. Task success rate. So this is pretty self-explanatory. Did the user find success in what they were trying to do? Time on task. Maybe you've shown that expert users only need, or let's say proficient users maybe, only need 5 seconds to complete a task, but all of your users for your new change, let's say, to your interface are taking 12 seconds. Okay, what's wrong there? So that can be a useful measure to funnel problems. Eye tracking, so like I said, this can be qualitative in the sense of we want to see where they're looking, but counts of fixations and location of fixations, pupil dilation, other biometrics aspects, those can be used quantitatively. User error rate, so how many times did the user do the wrong thing? A lot of times you can see this with also, and it usually needs to be, there's some nuance there, you want to be specific on what you're doing, but task abandonment, how many times they hit the back, button on the window or something like that. Conversion rate, this is where we get into more UX commercial principles, so how many folks who visit this thing end up converting into customers. Has some value from the business perspective. It's definitely something you need to know. But one question, right, is okay, if UX quality is the parameter of interest, conversion rate has some validity issues in terms of internal validity. We're not clear it's because of the UX. They might have bought it even if it was a bad UX. Maybe it was a good price or it's a compelling product. So, again, a value metric from a business case, from a UX case, less so. The system usability scale has been around for 30 years or so. It's a 10 question, if I remember right, 8 or 10 Likert scale questions about how usable something is. Can be helpful, still qualitative, but and subjective, but can be a valuable kind of benchmark. And the last two, Net Promoter Score and Customer Satisfaction, or CSAT. So these are, so customer satisfaction, we'll take that one first. If you've ever worked in retail or in a service industry that used customer surveys, you know that they're not necessarily a great measure of positive interactions. They can be a pretty good measure of negative ones, because people will be louder about negative experiences. But in terms of positive experiences, they're not as valuable. So again, you can use them, but take them with a grain of salt. Tons of validity issues if you look at it. Then we have a Net Promoter Score. This is one that you'll see kind of circulating through UX every so often, and people have their views, or there will be arguments about if it's valuable or not. It's essentially a measure of how likely someone would be to recommend a product or service. Same problem with conversion rate. I don't see how you draw a direct line from causation to where the UX caused them to promote it. It just, again, it has some problems there for that. So it's something you want to be aware of, though, because you'll probably hear it out in the commercial space. So what are the big questions we have to ask with measures? First, does this word mean what I think it means? When I say I want to measure happiness or workload or usability, am I instantiating that variable in a way that matches theoretically what we're talking about, what we know about it from a psychological perspective? Maybe there's a lot of empirical research around testing your particular variable. So first, you really have to explore that. Does it, what I'm using, is the way I'm using it the correct way? That feeds into, are we developing the construct correctly? It's one thing to say, yep, we're measuring happiness. It's another to say how you are, and then dig into each one of those parameters and see if they're really indicative of happiness. Next are the covariates mucking up our data. In the HCI space, 90% of the time, yes, there are, and it is hard to suss that out. Qualitative reliability. So this is one that sometimes quant folks will throw at you and say, well, just because you noted this thing doesn't mean that's real. That's just your opinion. Okay, true. And in psychology, we have solved this problem through inner rate of reliability measures, where if you have multiple people doing a qualitative, or they're, I guess, using a qualitative measure, or observational, this is also heavily used in observation, and they are trained on the measure and what you're trying to do, then you can compare their results, and if there's not a significant delta between them, then you can assume the measure, at least between the iterators, was reliable. So that is an important thing, and that follows kind of logically how we think about things. If one person tells you a thing, okay, it could be valuable data, but if 15 people tell you the exact same thing, that's a little bit more authoritative. Then does this generalize or does it need to? So this is a big thing I want to stress is, and it takes some nuance and it very much depends on what you're doing, but people generalize, situations don't. So for example, if you're developing an interface, let's say for aviation, I guess, you're developing an interface for some new, let's say a small plane, maybe a private jet or something. You're developing some new interface, I don't know. Okay, the aspects of that testing and that design that are explicit to aviation, that they're not going to generalize to, say, grid operations or accounting software, those things. But the aspects of your testing that are showing, oh, the people tend to do this, and it's like a human thing. It's not they're in this aviation context. They also do this outside of it or something. However you would find that. That's okay, in my opinion, because people generalize. The human in the cockpit is the same as the human in the accounting firm, is the same as the human in the software development cubicle farm, whatever. The people are largely the same, and so we can generalize on those topics. So it's just an important thing to know and make sure that you are taking care as you're going through that. But also that you can use other resources sometimes if it's not explicit to a situation. The people generalizations might still work. Alright, so now that's done. Next time, very probably, going to start getting into prototyping. So, alright, thanks.